Welcome back to my Holistic Game Developer's Guide to Game Development. And in this second video, we're going to look at how to create your very first project in Unity. Now, we've just installed a version of Unity. In this case, I'm using Unity 6.1, and you want to have a look at the version number you've got, because if you've got a number of 6.1 versions, they could all have these different sort of subversions. Mine is 1.9. Yours, if you're installing this much later than I am, it will be slightly different to this. Okay, so what we're going to do is go to the project with that version number in mind, and we will come over to New Project. We want to know which version we're building for, because that's the first thing that you're going to set in here. Now, anything with an LTS after it is a long time support product. That means if you're using it to develop a game and you find a bug and you can't fix something, Unity will actually support that for you. So you have that support. So I can choose to use that, or I can use 1.9, which I'm going to go with because we're actually going through Unity 6.1. So this is 6000, and then it's 0.1.9. Of course, yours might be different to that. So select that. Now, once you've done that, you're going to end up with all of these options to choose from down here. I'm not going to go through every single one of them and explain what they all are, because that's what the Unity documentation is for. But let's just quickly breeze over and have a look at what type of project you could create. Now, we're going to work through in this course using 3D game environments, because anything you learn to do in 3D will transcribe back into a 2D environment anyway, so we may as well go for the 3 dimensions. It's also worth coming to grips with some of the terminology that you're going to find through this list here when you're looking. The first thing you'll see is this SRP on these top 3 options. What is SRP? SRP is a scriptable render pipeline. That is Unity's, I guess, way of controlling the way the graphics are on the screen, so that when you create a game and it actually renders out to the screen, there's a whole series of operations that your code and objects in your game go through to end up as pixels on the screen. So this is Unity's way of doing it. Now, within the scriptable render pipeline, and don't worry if you don't fully understand that, when we get down the track and we start looking at materials and rendering, we'll look at that at much closer. Within there's a universal 2D, universal 3D, and then there's a high definition 3D. Now, the high definition environment is for creating things for, say, consoles. If you want to make something for your PlayStation or your Xbox, something that has really high-end graphics, that's what you would go for with the high definition. Anything you created in a high definition 3D won't necessarily run on things like iPads or mobile phones, or sort of lesser computers. If you want to create something that's kind of for everybody, you want to go for the universal render pipeline, which is this one here. Now, we will be using this, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Underneath there, you've also got this 3D built-in render pipeline. Now, this is the pipeline that Unity started with. So you can also use this if you want the basic, standard, original render pipeline. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with it if you want to use it. It also supports a whole bunch of different platforms and will, I think, pretty much work on anything. Though I guess that would probably end up being phased out now that there's these other ones. Then what else is in here? You've got some learning examples. You've got some starting out like 3D and 2D mobile projects. And these things are just going to basically populate your project with different assets and functionality. So think of them like templates. Like a Word document has a template which has things sort of set out for it. These project starters here also do. Anyway, feel free to go through and have a look at those on your own. We're going to go with the Universal 3D, so I'm just going to click on it to select it. Now, over on the right is where you set up your project locations and everything like that, as well as the project name, of course. So the location here is where you want to store it. Now this link here currently goes, if I have a look, into my iCloud folder here. I have found that sometimes it's not best to actually be developing in an iCloud folder, because they can take the files off of your machine, so that when you go to open up your project, they're not there anymore and have to download it, and it takes forever. So I'm going to go into my development folder, which is actually on my machine, and I'm going to create a new folder. Let's call it My First Project, and click on create. Then we will select that folder, and you'll see here that this is actually on one of my external drives, but it's still My First Project. And then over here in project name, we're going to call this My First Unity Project. I'm going to make it slightly different with the name so that we can have a look at the difference between the folder and the name in a moment. Okay, so then we click on Create Project. After clicking that, you might get some terms and conditions, so just agree to those. And at this point, you can definitely go and have a cup of coffee and probably a piece of cake, because this actually does take quite a long time to go through and install all these packages. And eventually Unity will open. Now, it might be laid out like mine is, it might not be, but we'll talk about that in the next video. But what you might find is that you have like an error down the bottom here as well. You can find your console, and if you can't find a console window anywhere, you can go up to Window, Panels, Console, which will bring it up for you, and then in there you can just hit the clear button. Sometimes you just get like these little loading bugs that pop up, and you can just clear them without any issue, so don't get overly concerned about that. Right, now before we start playing around with Unity, it's worth going into your folder where you created your project and having a look at how it's actually set up. Now, if you remember, my folder that I created for the project was called My First Project. And then I called my project My First Unity Project. So when you give the project a name, it actually creates a new folder for that particular project. I could actually create another project and put it in the same folder here and give it another name like Penny's Test, and it would show up as its own folder here. So this is the folder representing your project that you've got open up in Unity, and you can see at the top the name of this project here is the same as the folder that's set down here. Once you open that folder up, you'll see a whole bunch of different files. Now, something I always tell my students, do not go playing around in these folders. Don't delete stuff, don't add stuff, don't move things around, don't rename them. Do everything through the Unity editor. I'm only going through these now for you just to explain what all these folders are and to basically tell you not to really touch them. Okay, so there's a lot of settings folders, there's a lot of different libraries that are included that the editor uses. There's log files, packages. This is sort of like any extra functionality that is going to go into your project. It might be AI, it could be some sort of rendering thing. You've got your project settings, which you also do inside of the editor itself. Temporary files and user settings and things like that. The most important folder in this whole thing that basically has all of the assets for your project is the assets folder here. This folder is the one that you will actually see inside of Unity. And then whatever's in here, except for the .meta files, okay, you won't actually see those. They're kind of settings files. You won't see those in the editor. Let's have a look in the editor at this assets folder and where it's revealed. So I'm just going to drag that down out of the road. Back in my project, I'm going to find the project tab. Again, if you can't find your project tab, just go Window, Panels, and down to project to find it. In the project tab, you'll see the top folder here called assets. And inside of assets, if you click on it, you can see these items here. Now, this is a graphical representation of what you're seeing in your folder just here. So you can see there's something called Text Mesh Pro folder, and which is just here. And then if you open that up and come over and open up your Text Mesh Pro folder, you'll then see that there's a fonts, a resources, a shaders, and a sprites folder in there, as well as these meta files, I guess, which is just information that Unity uses for configuring things. Very important that you don't go playing around with these. And I think that's probably the third time that I've said that. Now, in addition to these assets, and I know I said that the assets folder is the most important, and it kind of is, because it's the one you really have the most control over, where you put all of your assets for your game and how you structure your actual project. You've also got access in this project tab to this packages. These are, I guess, functionality that you can install into your project. So you've got like an AI navigation, burst, collections. There's a whole bunch of different things. Depending on the type of project you start with, like the templates that we talked about earlier, you'll get a different set of packages in here that you can use. Now, these packages you can remove and add them at will. Again, if you don't know what you're doing, don't touch this, and definitely do not touch the packages folder here, which is just giving a list of what those packages are that you can see, which it then installs in there. Okay, so that is where your project ends up. If you ever want to move your project, the best thing is that you take this project folder here and zip it up and then move that zip folder so that everything goes with it. However, if you are going to zip it, make sure that you shut Unity first to ensure that all the temporary files and other files are all saved. That's not the ideal way of doing things. Down the track in this series, we will look at how to hook all this up to GitHub so that you can actually move and check out your folder and also keep different versions of it, which is much better than moving folders around here. Okay, now that you have a bit of a sense of the actual structure of the project underneath, what we'll do in the next video is come back and we'll start looking at all these different windows and what we use them for when we're creating a game.